Lina had always said she wanted to learn English, but she had never stopped to ask herself why. It was just something she felt she should do, like eating healthy or exercising. The old man's words made her pause in a way she hadn't expected. That night, after her shift ended, she walked home through the quiet streets, the sound of her shoes tapping on the pavement. She thought about her vague dream of speaking English. Why did it matter to her? At first, the reasons that came to mind were simple. She wanted to answer customers more confidently, maybe get a better job, maybe even impress her friends. But as she kept walking, deeper thoughts began to surface. She remembered a customer from months ago who had told her about his travels through Europe, describing cities in words she couldn't understand. She remembered the feeling of watching an English movie, laughing at the expressions but missing the jokes because she had to wait for the subtitles. She remembered the time she had found a book at a second-hand shop, its cover beautiful, its pages full of English words she couldn't read, and how she had put it back on the shelf with a sigh. By the time she reached home, she realized her reasons went far beyond polite conversation. She wanted to live in the language, read books without translations, watch plays and films in their original words, make friends in different countries without struggling for sentences, and maybe even travel the world without feeling lost. The thought made her heart beat faster. The next morning when she woke up, she didn't just think, I should study English. She thought, I'm building the key to the life I want. That shift changed everything. English was no longer a chore, it was a bridge, and every word she learned would bring her one step closer to the life she had just begun to picture clearly in her mind. Consistency sounded simple when the old man mentioned it, but Lina quickly discovered it was one of the hardest truths to follow. In the past, she would study English for hours on a free Sunday, filling pages with vocabulary and grammar rules, only to set her notebook aside for days, sometimes weeks, until she had time again. Each time she returned, it felt like starting over. The old man's advice echoed in her mind. 15 minutes every day is better than 3 hours once a week. At first, it didn't seem powerful. Could such a small effort really make a difference? Still, she decided to try. The very next day, before work, she set a timer for 15 minutes and practiced listening to a short English conversation on her phone. The following day, she repeated the process, this time reading a short story. Soon, she found ways to weave English into her routine without disrupting her life. She listened to English songs while preparing breakfast, practiced new phrases while walking to the cafe, and reviewed vocabulary during quiet moments at work. It didn't matter if she felt tired or busy. She never missed her daily time. Weeks later, she began to notice a quiet change. Words that once felt foreign started to feel familiar. Sentences formed in her mind faster. The language was no longer something she visited once in a while. It had become part of her daily life. Lina realized that consistency was not about the size of the step, but about never stopping the walk. Like water carving a path through stone, her small daily moments of practice were shaping her into the English speaker she wanted to be. And once it became a habit, she no longer had to fight herself to keep going. Her routine carried her forward. Mistakes had always been Lina's greatest fear. In school, every red mark on her English test felt like a wound, proof that she wasn't good enough. Because of this, she had learned to stay quiet, speaking only when she was certain she wouldn't be wrong. But the old man's words, mistakes are not signs of failure, they are the path itself, planted a new thought in her mind. The very next day, she decided to test it. When a tourist asked her for directions to the train station, she answered in English. She stumbled over the words, mixing up turn right with go straight, but the tourist smiled and understood her anyway. That moment surprised her. She had made mistakes, yet the message still reached the listener. Encouraged, Lina began to speak more, even when she wasn't sure of every word. Sometimes her grammar was wrong, sometimes she mispronounced a word, but each time she noticed something important. People were far more interested in understanding her than in judging her. And every time she made a mistake, she remembered it more clearly than the words she had said correctly. She started to see mistakes as bright flags marking the places where she needed to grow. If she used the wrong tense, she made a note of it and practiced it that evening. If she forgot a word, she looked it up and tried it again the next day. Over time, these errors became like stepping stones, each one helping her cross the river between confusion and fluency. Lina realized that mistakes were not a wall blocking her path. They were the map showing her exactly where to go next. Once she stopped fearing them, she found herself learning faster than ever before. Listening became the foundation of Lina's progress. Though at first, she didn't understand why it mattered so much. She thought speaking was the most important skill, but the old man reminded her, before a baby says a single word, it listens for months. Those words stayed with her. She began to notice how often she skipped over listening in her old study habits. She would focus on grammar exercises or memorizing vocabulary lists, but when someone spoke quickly in English, her mind froze. It wasn't that she didn't know the words, it was that she wasn't used to hearing them flow naturally. Determined to change that, Lina made listening a daily habit. On her way to work, she played short English podcasts about cooking, travel, and everyday life. At first, she understood almost nothing, just a few scattered words, but she kept going, letting the sounds of English wash over her without worrying about catching every detail. After a few weeks, something unexpected happened. She began recognizing familiar phrases without having to translate them in her head. The speed of native speakers no longer felt like a wall. It began to sound like a rhythm she could follow. She also picked up the natural way sentences were spoken, where voices rose and fell, where pauses came, and which words were stressed. Soon, she found herself copying these patterns when she spoke, making her English sound more natural without even trying. Listening wasn't just helping her understand others, it was quietly training her mouth to speak better too. Lina realized that listening wasn't a side activity, it was the doorway to fluency, and every minute she spent on it was building the foundation for the English she dreamed of speaking. Reading had always felt slow to Lina, almost like walking through a forest where every tree was a new word she had to stop and examine. But the old man told her, reading feeds your mind the way food feeds your body. The more you read, the richer your words become. She decided to test this for herself. Instead of starting with thick novels or complex articles, she chose simple English storybooks meant for children. At first, it felt strange, too easy, maybe even childish, but she discovered something powerful. She could finish an entire story without getting stuck. This gave her a sense of accomplishment she had never felt before in English. Little by little, she moved on to short news articles, blog posts, and social media captions. Each time she read, she circled or wrote down new words that caught her attention, but she didn't interrupt herself to look them up immediately. She kept reading, letting the meaning unfold from the context. Over time, she noticed that reading wasn't just teaching her new vocabulary, it was showing her how words worked together, how sentences flowed, and how ideas were expressed in a natural way. She began to hear English in her head when she read, almost like the characters or writers were speaking directly to her. Lina realized that reading wasn't homework. It was a secret conversation with the language itself. Every page she turned was like adding another brick to the foundation of her English skills. And the more she read, the more confident she became, not only in understanding others, but in expressing her own thoughts clearly and beautifully. Writing had always been the skill Lina avoided most. She feared making mistakes, thinking every sentence had to be perfect before it was worth putting on paper. The old man saw her hesitation and said, "A blank page is not your enemy. It is your training ground. Mistakes are proof that you are building something." At first, she started small, just a few sentences each morning about her day, her feelings, or something she had learned. She didn't worry about grammar or spelling, she just wrote. Over time, she noticed patterns in her mistakes, and instead of feeling ashamed, she treated them like clues. Each wrong verb tense, each misplaced word was a sign pointing to what she needed to work on. Soon, she challenged herself to write short stories and personal reflections in English. Some days, she even wrote letters to imaginary friends or to her future self, describing her dreams in vivid detail. She discovered that writing forced her to think in English, to search for the right words, and to connect ideas in a logical way. As weeks turned into months, her sentences grew longer, her vocabulary richer, and her ideas more precise. She no longer translated in her head, she simply wrote. Writing became more than practice. It became a mirror, showing her how far she had come and where she could still grow. Lina learned that the pen or the keyboard was a silent teacher, one that patiently waited for her every day, ready to turn her thoughts into a visible path toward fluency. Listening had always felt like the hardest skill for Lina. People spoke too fast, words seemed to blend together, and by the time she understood one sentence, the next three had already passed. One evening, the old man told her, "You cannot catch every drop of rain in a storm, but if you stand in it long enough, you will feel the rhythm." She began listening to English every day, not as a student cramming for an exam, but as a traveler tuning into the music of a new land. She started with slow, clear podcasts for learners, focusing on understanding the main idea rather than every single word. At first it was frustrating, but she resisted the urge to pause and rewind constantly. Gradually, she added English songs, movies with subtitles, and even conversations from YouTube channels. She listened not just to what people said, but to how they said it, the rise and fall of their voices, the pauses, the emotion behind the words. Over time, she realized that her ears were adjusting like muscles becoming stronger. One day, she caught herself understanding an entire conversation between two tourists in a cafe without even trying. She wasn't translating. She was simply hearing the meaning. That moment felt like a door opening, proof that listening wasn't about chasing every word, but about letting the sound of English flow through her until her mind began to think in it naturally. From then on, listening became her silent daily ritual, the bridge between knowing English and truly living it. Speaking had always been the most intimidating part for Lina. Reading and writing could be done in private. Listening could be practiced quietly, but speaking meant exposure. It meant others could hear her mistakes, her accent, her hesitation. She often stayed silent in conversations, afraid that people would judge her. One afternoon, the old man said, "Your voice is the bridge between your thoughts and the world. If you never cross it, no one will know what treasures you carry." Those words stayed with her. The next day, she decided to speak, even if her sentences were broken. She started small, ordering food in English, greeting strangers, asking simple questions. She also began speaking to herself at home, narrating her actions in English. "I'm making tea," she'd say. "Now I'm opening the window." It felt silly at first, but it loosened her tongue and made English feel less like a subject and more like a living language. To push herself further, she joined online language exchanges and video calls with learners from other countries. At first, she stumbled and repeated herself, but the more she spoke, the more she realized something important. Communication wasn't about perfection, it was about connection. People cared more about understanding her than about whether her grammar was flawless. With every conversation, her confidence grew. The fear that once silenced her began to fade, replaced by a sense of freedom. Speaking, she discovered, was not the final step in learning English. It was the very thing that pulled all her skills together and made the language truly hers. Lina used to think learning English was about collecting as many words and grammar rules as possible. Her notebooks were filled with endless vocabulary lists and complicated explanations, yet she still struggled to speak naturally. One day, the old man smiled and told her, "Language is not a mountain you climb. It's a road you walk every day, and the only way forward is small, steady steps." From then on, she began treating English like a daily habit instead of a once-in-a-while project. Each morning, she read a short English article over breakfast. In the afternoons, she listened to a podcast while walking to work. Before bed, she wrote 3 sentences about her day in a journal. None of these activities took more than 15 minutes, but they kept English alive in her life every single day. She also learned to weave English into things she already enjoyed. She loved cooking, so she started watching recipes in English. She enjoyed music, so she memorized song lyrics and sang along. By connecting the language to her passions, English stopped feeling like a chore and started feeling like a natural part of her world. Weeks turned into months, and without realizing it, Lina began thinking in English. Sentences came faster, grammar felt more automatic, and she no longer needed to translate everything in her head. She realized the truth. The secret wasn't studying harder for a short time, but practicing consistently for a long time. In the end, English became less like a subject in her life and more like a companion that walked beside her every day.